what happened in Canton this weekend. Plus, Tiger Woods withdraws from Bridgestone. Is this it for Tiger? Fans, don't get mad at me. That's just a question. But first, let's talk about Friday night. If you watched that exhibition on Friday night, it was painful to see what happened to Paul George. The Pacers forward suffered a compound fracture in his right leg during Friday's Team USA scrimmage in Las Vegas. George had successful surgery later that night, but sources close to the situation told ESPN that doctors believe George will miss all of next season. Mark Cuban, owner of the Dallas Mavericks, has been one of the most outspoken critics of the international basketball and had some strong comments after Paul George's injury. He said this: the international Olympics were about patriotism and national pride instead of money. All right, so many people discuss this, especially after we saw what happened to Paul George. And I'll ask you first, George, should teams keep their players off Team USA?
No, they should absolutely keep them on Team USA. And look, I understand what Mark Cuban is saying. I do. Yes. I get it. And I'm not going to be the guy that's going to defend the IOC. He's right. It's one of the most corrupt organizations we have in all of sports. FIFA's right up there as well. So I'm not going to sit here and pander for the IOC. I agree with him in that regard. But here's the other thing. International play helps the NBA's brand. Let's not try to make this out like it doesn't help them in any way, shape, or form. At the bottom line, this thing is about dollars and cents, and the international brand helps them in that regard. It's why David Stern has been pushing for it for a long time. Adam Silver most recently said, we're not going to stop playing internationally. So I think that there are things here that owners complain about that, you know, it's easy for them to take that particular stance. It's easy to take a stance against the IOC because nobody buys into them. Everyone feels the same way about them. But nobody complains when these guys are playing in the summer anyway. Yeah. That's what these guys do. They're playing in the summer regardless whether it's organized hoops with Team USA or they're getting together with a couple of guys. Remember during the free agency drama, we had Kevin Love, Carmelo Anthony, and Kobe Bryant working out together. Sure. And no one was talking about that. So these things are going to happen. Guys are going to play, and you know, everyone complains when something goes wrong, but it's just a freak occurrence, I think.
Okay. Well said. Finally, someone agrees with me from the standpoint of this is what players do. I mean, Mark Cuban's going to have a lot more supporters based on what happened on Friday night. Let's say if this happened to DeMarcus Cousins, no disrespect to him, right. He's not on the same line with Paul George. If this happened to DeMarcus Cousins, we're not having this kind of dialogue, mainly because Paul George is a burgeoning star, a burgeoning superstar with a team that a lot of people have gotten to know over the last couple of years in the Indiana Pacers, a person that a lot of people have gotten to know in Paul George. So, yeah, Mark Cuban's going to start to have a lot more groundswell of support based on the injury that happened on Friday night. But let's be honest. When Larry Bird says, you know what, this could have happened anytime, anywhere, I think that guy knows a little bit about playing in the NBA and what guys are all about. And believe me, there was a great article in USA Today written by Sam Amick in which Kevin Love was almost reduced to tears pulling away from USA basketball to qualify for the World Cup because of all the trade stuff going on involving his name. He wanted to be a part of this. That's what it comes down to. The players want to play. They clearly understand that the IOC, you're right, George, they're rife with corruption. And Mark Cuban has a point about they're playing the NBA. But the players don't mind being a part of this. Playing those guys want to have that USA across the front of their chest. Yeah, they know that it doesn't mean anything to them from a financial standpoint.
Oh, no, but it does. But it absolutely does. No, because when they're playing internationally,
exactly.
You know, they can go to Asia and Europe and sell their products.
I'm not talking about getting I'm not talking about the salary in terms of getting a salary because the players don't get paid. But the shoe companies, part of this, oh, yeah, they're getting big money from the shoe companies. Let's be honest here. It is about dollars and cents. It's about dollars and common sense, whatever you want to chance and whatever you want to put it in. But if the players want to play, outside of using the clause in which the San Antonio Spurs put at Manu Ginobili, if there's a medical event and they invoke that clause, other than that, if players are going to play, Mark Cuban, guys like that in the world will not be able to stop them.
Well, what's the solution then? Because Mark Cuban's like, well, we should take a page out of soccer's book and do 22 and under or 21 and under like soccer does. But here's the thing. I'll look at it this way. So those guys aren't going to get hurt, too?
Exactly.
And by the way, those guys don't have a $100 million payday guaranteed coming to them. So if anything, I think that's a worse solution because you're talking about kids who don't have money in the bank like Paul George. And look, we all hope Paul George has a speedy recovery. He's one of the best young up-and-rising players in the NBA. Yeah. But look, he's at least got the financial security. Those young guys, 22 and under, would probably not have.
George, to Freddie's point, if it wasn't Paul George, would this really be an issue?
I still think it would be an issue because any of those guys on that team are franchise cornerstone type players. So, yeah, I do think it would be an issue regardless of who it was on that particular team.
Now, if I'm a fan of the Indiana Pacers, I'm having a different dialogue because now I'm going to see a guy that's about to go into the first year of a 5-year, $92 million contract, and that guy's not going to be out there. So the knee-jerk reaction, if I'm a fan, and if this happened, if I'm a fan of Oklahoma City, if it happened to Kevin Durant, if I'm a Cleveland Cavaliers fan, if it happened to Kyrie Irving, if I'm a Sacramento Kings fan, if it happened to DeMarcus Cousins, I'm thinking, oh, wait a minute. I know they want to represent the United States. That's all well and good, but it's a World Cup. It's not the Olympics. What's going to happen for my basketball team? And a lot of that conversation happened on Friday. I'm not going to blame the fans for feeling that way because I know if I don't have Paul George in my line, if I'm a Pacers fan, I'm thinking, oh, my goodness.
Oh, yeah, they have every right to be upset.
They have every right to be upset from that standpoint. But I think if you ask Paul George if he knew what the risk would be involved, would he do it again? He said, yeah, because he wanted to represent his team. He said, you know what, I can't wait to be the defensive stopper on this basketball team in the World Cup. I can't wait to play with Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving and James Harden. Players want to play. They want to be out there. Mark Cuban makes a fair point because he's a businessman, and he sees a lot of that money that they have to pay, and that guy's not going to be there, but the players still want to play, and I think it would be very hard to keep them from doing that.
Players do want to play, and here's another aspect that I think GMs and owners miss out on. These guys get better, especially a guy like Paul George who's only 23, 24 years old, whatever he is. He's young in his early 20s. He's going to get better playing with Kevin Durant and playing against these guys day in and day out. That's how he's going to expand his game. And that's nobody ever complains when the guy comes back healthy and expands his game. But if there's an injury or if he goes deep into the playoffs and he looks fatigued, that's when we get complaints.
You speak of fans not being happy, obviously, with the Paul George injury. Let's take that a little further. The aftermath, according to Nate Silver, of 38 metrics, of 538 metrics, the Pacers are projected to win 44 games this season without Paul George on the court. That would translate to a 5 or 6 seed in the Eastern Conference. So, Freddie, help me understand. What impact do you believe George's injury will have on the team?
It's huge because now do you run the ball through Roy Hibbert? I don't know if that's a good idea if you're a Pacers fan or if you're Frank Vogel, the head coach. Do you run the ball through David West? I know they brought in C.J. Miles and Rodney Stuckey in the offseason. Let's face it, those two guys together are now Paul George. And I think the most underrated aspect about why this is huge, he became, and I think, grew up as a leader because they had a lot of adverse situations, self-inflicted, but a lot of that from the outside. And Paul George was able to try to pull them together because can you imagine the disaster it would have been for the Indiana Pacers if they had lost the Atlanta Hawks in the first round when they were down 3-2, or they lost the Washington Wizards in the second round? With all that went on, Paul George was still balling out for the Indiana Pacers, and they still made, even though it's a watered-down Eastern Conference, they still made the Eastern Conference Finals. So I think this team, 42, 43 wins at best, but I think the one thing they're really going to miss, Paul George was growing and maturing into a leader. Who's going to take that spot? Because it seems to me on that basketball team right now, that person does not exist, which means that Larry Bird have to have counseling with these players and say, it's time for you to step up. Maybe David West can really do it again because he was kind of ceding that to Paul George of this basketball team. So now he has to step back into that role. Does Roy Hibbert have enough in him to do that? I still question about that because I want him to work on his game more than being a leader because that needs to be fixed. So I think Paul George not being there as the leader or an extra leader with this basketball team, I think will have as much of an effect when you take his 23 points, 8 rebounds, and 5 assists out of that lineup.
Well, this is very simple. The Indiana Pacers were a top 3 team in the Eastern Conference with Paul George, and now they're not. It's just that simple.
Absolutely.
44 and 38. Look, and Nate Silver and those guys at 538 do an awesome job with the metrics. I think they may be even a little worse than that potentially because I think there are certain teams in the East that have gotten better, and obviously the West is stacked, and they don't have to play them as many times, but they still have to play the game. So I look at them as probably around 40 to 42 wins. But in the Eastern Conference, that'll get you in the playoffs.
Yeah, I was going to say.
That'll get you a 7 or an 8 seed more than likely, even if the East is better this year, which we all assume will be at least a little better this particular season. But that's the problem now. If you're Indiana, look, in sports we have a small window to win championships.
Absolutely.
And maybe Indiana, people could say, well, they weren't going to beat the Cavs, they weren't going to beat the Bulls if they're healthy, this, that, and the other. You don't know that. You don't know how the season is going to play out. So, but they were going to at least be in that mix. Now that's not the case anymore. So if I'm an Indiana fan, yeah, I'm upset. I'm upset because of that. And, you know, there's nothing you could do. Freak things happen, and that's just the reality of it. But in the Eastern Conference, you're basically looking at 2 teams at the top right now. You're looking at Cleveland, you're looking at Chicago, and then it's everybody else after that.
Really?
And what happened?
Maybe the Wizards?
Not even
Maybe
Miami?
No, the Miami and the Wizards, to me, those teams are vying for that 3rd spot now. That's where they're vying for now.
Here's the deal if I'm a Pacers fan, because I'm worried about Paul George, the person, because he may be out for 1 year. We don't know how he's going to come back from that injury because not trying to compare Paul George to Kevin Ware, skill set different level, NBA, different level in college basketball. But Kevin Ware now is at Georgia State. And even he said, I don't have any advice for Paul George because he's stronger than I am, but mentally this is something that he's never had to deal with.
Right.
So now you have to wonder how this is going to affect Paul George going forward, because it's one thing to say I'm going to come back from this injury. The mind can be very debilitating against you when you don't know what's going to happen. When you say, okay, I think I can do those things all over again, but you really don't know from that standpoint. So it's not, to me, it's not important that Paul George gets back in the basketball court. I want his state of mind to be right. And if the state of mind is right, then whatever happens after that, that I can deal with, and I think Pacers fans have to deal with that. But 5 years, $92 million a max contract, boy, oh boy, that figure is going to be next to his name regarding this.
Freddie, let me stick with something George said that I thought was interesting. Cavs, Chicago, 1 and 2. Miami Wizard vying for that 3. Pacers maybe a 7 seed.
I think they're definitely in the lower half.
Okay,
I agree with that.
You agree?
I agree with
that lineup.
You lose a guy like that. I'm telling you, Paul George is as important to his basketball team as just about anybody in the NBA, because that's what superstars are. Look at your Los Angeles Lakers.
Well, and let's not
Kobe
forget,
Bryant not there. Look what happened in that basketball.
They lost Lance too.
And lost Lance
That's
Stevens.
the other thing.
He's now with the Hornets, which now you can't think for 1 second now that the Hornets are going to be a better team than the Pacers. You have to think that because Stevenson is there with Kemba Walker, Al Jefferson.
Right, but the seeding is going to be different. They may have a better record than Indiana, but based on, like, look, if Charlotte wins the division, they'll be a top 4 seed. But that's the thing, is that they may or may not, depending on the way things shake out.
Yeah.
You know?
Gentlemen, let's leave it there. Coming up after the break, we have someone joining us, and we'll talk. Actually, there he is.